we're at the Muleshoe Heritage Foundation, where today some guests came to look at especially the half dugout here that has just recently been opened at the Muleshoe Heritage Complex, which, by the way, if you have not gone through, you need to come out and go through the half dugout. And also this house we're sitting in, it's the Figure 4 Ranch House, which was located about 1.5 miles southwest originally from that half dugout. And these were all out in the south part of Bailey County in the Goodland Maple area. And Allene Bowman, you know a little bit about that half dugout, don't you?
Yes, I do. I lived there 63 years ago today.
63 years ago you were living there.
Yeah.
How old were you at that time?
I was 12.
You were 12 years old, and so I guess you were a child of the family of, and who were, oh, there's that train. Well, that makes that realistic, doesn't it? You didn't have any trains, though, out there by the half dugout, but we certainly do right here by the Heritage Foundation, right off of U.S. Highway 84 west edge of Muleshoe. Now, your parents were whom?
Jim and Lena Gentry.
And so your father was actually the one who was killed that day when the lightning struck out there.
That is true.
Now, where were you at that time?
I was sitting out in the car cutting out paper dolls.
You were sitting in the car. Do you remember what kind of car it was?
It was about an old 32 model something. It wasn't even running. But I remember when the lightning struck like that, it flashed all over the dash of that car. Really? The lightning did, and it knocked the scissors out of my hand.
Oh my goodness! And you were how old at that time?
At 12 years.
You were 12, so I know you'll never forget that.
No, I won't, honey.
And it killed your father, Jim Gentry.
Uh-huh.
How old was he at that time?
He was 51 years, 3 months, and 2 days.
You've got a good memory.
Uh-huh.
And tell me about the paper dolls. Some people don't know what paper dolls, today children don't have paper dolls like you played with. Tell us what paper dolls were like then.
Well, honey, we used to cut out a doll with a pretty picture, a pretty dress on, and we'd cut it out, and then we'd cut out other things that would fit them paper dolls.
And you cut them out of what, Alan?
The Sears catalog.
Out of the Sears catalog. You didn't go to Sears or any place else and buy those paper dolls?
No, ma'am.
Uh-huh. And so were you alone in the car?
No, I was, my sister, Lucy Lena, was in there with me.
And was she older or younger?
Younger.
How old was she?
She was 7.
And is she still living?
No.
And now where do you live today?
I live in Portales, and I'm the last surviving one of my family.
How many children of the Jim Gentrys?
There was 5.
5 of you. Now, you had a brother who had on those little trousers that are on display there at the half dugout. And now, what was his name?
Henry.
And Henry is deceased, right?
Yes.
Uh-huh. But didn't he actually give the trousers to the Heritage Foundation?
Yes,
What
he
he
did,
was-
but he did that back when the Muleshoe had a recreation museum.
Yeah, well, to the Heritage Foundation.
Yes,
This, And now, where did he live before he died?
Well, he died in the nursing home there in
He
Portales.
lived in Portales. And so now, how old was he when this happened?
Well, you mean after the lightning struck him?
Well, how old was he when the lightning struck?
He was 10 years old, honey.
He was 10. And so did he always remember that also? I'm sure he did at 10, didn't he?
Well, honey, He remembers parts of it, but he was unconscious for a long time.
Uh-huh. And so he was absolutely very lucky, or it was a miracle that he survived
it.
And you can look at those trousers and see that, can't you?
He was just, they just peeled all the skin.
He was burned.
It was a bad burn.
And so now, how long did your family actually live in the Half Dugout?
Well, we moved out of it pretty soon after that and moved up north of Goodland. West of Goodland, a half a mile.
And so how long had you lived in the dugout then before the accident?
Probably about a year.
Do you know who owned the dugout when you all were living there?
Well, we always thought Mr. Hanover did.
Oh, the one who actually lived down in the Figure 4 ranch house. If he didn't, maybe he was responsible for it.
Yeah, I think that's probably what it was.
Now tell me your name.
My name's Judy Hargrove.
And now, Judy, how are you in this family group that's here today at the Heritage Complex?
Allene's my mother-in-law.
And where do you live?
I live in Portales.
So I'm sure that all the time that you have been in this family, you've heard these stories.
Yes, and I knew her mother.
Did you really?
Yeah, I was very close to her mother, and I knew all her sisters and brothers too before they passed away. But yeah, and I've heard all the stories. And
do you have anything to add to what she has said that maybe adds anything to the stories of living in the Half Dugout or the day the lightning struck?
I've heard the stories about how people in Portales helped them, the people that took them in and helped them when Henry was so sick. And I remember Ma saying, that's Allene's mother, she didn't even get to go to her own husband's funeral because Henry was so sick.
Now, where did they take Henry, the little boy who was 10, when that happened? Was to Portales. There was a hospital there in Portales.
And his doctor was Dr. Wright. Back then, I remember that my mother saying Dr. Wright.
And so I'm sure he stayed in the hospital quite some time.
Well, about 10 days, I think.
And then the funeral was held, if I remember correctly, in the Half Dugout. Was that right?
That is true.
And anything else that you have heard or remember someone saying?
No, not offhand. I can't think of anything. But they're just a wonderful family, and they have such a rich heritage, and they've all been very dear to me.
Now, have you been over to the Half Dugout before?
Yes, many times.
And so I guess are you pleased with the way it's been restored?
Yes, I'm very happy about it.
I bet. Had you been before today?
No, I hadn't ever. I always wanted to go, but I never did. Some of my kids had gone with their dad, but I had never gone before. And I was very surprised to see how big it was compared to my idea of how it was.
Now, actually living in it, what can you remember about actually living in the Half Dugout?
Well, honey, I remember us being one big happy family, and my daddy had bought a Victrola just like the one that's in here.
In this house?
In this house, from the same company in Amarillo, and we played that. We played lots of records and even danced on the floor.
Now, was it a dirt floor?
No. Well, it was darker than it is now. The concrete was
was a concrete floor.
Yeah, it was. But it seemed like it was a little bit darker then than it does, than it appears now.
And now we've talked about your sister that was with you that day in the car, and your brother Henry, who was injured when the lightning struck. But what about your others? Is there another sibling or a couple more?
There's the brother that these kids' daddy. Honey, we had an old horse that you couldn't hardly move by poking it, but Perry got on it, their daddy got on it, and he got it up to a high lope going up to the store to tell the Matheny's that lightning had killed my daddy.
So the Matheny's ran a store at Goodland? At Goodland. And so Perry Gentry was your brother. Was he older or younger than you?
He was older. He was 14.
He was 14. And so where did you all go to school?
Well, I went to Goodland till we moved to Texas in 1938. We moved back to Texas.
To New Mexico? And so you went to school at Goodland?
I did until I moved back to Texas, East Texas.
Oh, okay. They briefly went to East Texas.
Just tell the story about Rosie and the tea set.
Well, Daddy had come to Muleshoe the day before, and that was my baby sister's 3rd birthday, and he bought her a little set of 10 Mickey Mouse dishes.
Oh, really?
And I remember him sitting in the floor of that dugout. She was pouring tea, and he was sipping it out of the cups of playing, with her.
And that was the last night of his life then? And so now, wonder where he bought that. He came to Muleshoe and bought that for her birthday. So did he ever say where he bought it?
No, he didn't.
And this was what date? What year?
In 1936, the 19th of December, 19th of September.
Well, there wouldn't have been a lot of places that he could have bought that little tea set. I know one of the places here in the early years of Muleshoe was called Smith's Mercantile Store.
St. Clair's.
Oh, you think it was here in 36? It might.
I think it was St. Clair's comes back to me.
Okay. All right. Well, that was one of the stores later on after Smith's.
Well, I know in 38 when we moved through here, my mother wrote a check to St. Clair's.
Really?
Dry goods store. And I think she still got that check and some of her stuff at home.
My goodness. Now, I guess the pants that your brother Henry was wearing all were put up and kept by the family all those many years, sort of as a keepsake.
Yeah, my mother hung on to them till he decided, after we started working on the cemetery over there at Maple, he sent them over to Muleshoe.
And so now, is your father buried there at Maple in the cemetery?
Yes, he is.
And is your mother buried there also?
No, she's buried in Portales.
And what year did she die?
In 1980.
83? Well, in maybe the early 80s. Well, I'm going to pass the microphone down. These are your niece and nephew over here, and they're Perry Gentry's children. And you all introduce yourselves and tell us stories that you remember about the dugout or your father's family or the day that the lightning struck and killed your grandfather.
I remember the songs that they sang at his funeral was "Shall We Gather at the River," and I can't think of the other one now, but people brought and the flowers that was there was come out of people's yards.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Bonnie Gentry Thornburg, and I live in Sun City, Arizona. And I wish I'd paid more attention when my grandmother talked about the dugout and things here in Texas, but basically I just gathered that it was a very hard life, but they were happy as a family. And then when my grandfather was killed, the family was disrupted and had to move here, there, and everywhere, and finally ended up in Portales, New Mexico. But their neighbors and friends were very kind and very good to them, and I think that's wonderful. And this is my brother, Walter.
My name is Walter Gentry, and I live in Alameda, California. And unfortunately, as a child growing up, my father didn't speak very much about those times. They were hard times. And quite frankly, I didn't know that dugout even still existed until a few years ago. My Aunt Allene sent me a picture of it. And then I was pretty much amazed that they had actually taken that dugout. I didn't know you could move a dugout, but they moved it into Muleshoe, and I'm happy they did that. And I was really amazed to get to walk down through a place I never thought that I would ever see. But like most young punks running around, I didn't pay much attention to these old folks and their tales. So I really don't know much about it or have anything to add there. But I really thank you for bringing that over here and for this whole heritage area you have here.
Tell us about your father, Perry Gentry.
Well, all the time I knew him, he worked as a mechanic, and I think back in those days, I think he had gotten a job in a creamery. But when those were a bunch of hard times, and those guys lived a hard life, and they lived through that Great Depression, and they finally got out of that by going off to war. And the ones that survived that came back. They didn't even know if as far as they were concerned, there'd still be a depression when they got back home. Luckily, that didn't pan out. The country, the economy kicked up because of the war, and he made a pretty good living there. But he was a mechanic all of his life that I knew him. And we lived in Arizona, and then he worked overseas. He worked a couple of years in Peru, South America. And he got back from there, and he worked several years in West Pakistan. That was back during the early 60s when they were building these big dams all over the world. And he worked there for several years as a mechanic. And then he moved back to Portales, and that's where he died. And actually, he died when he was about 53. Yeah, he died at a young age.
What age? I mean, what year?
1975, I believe it was. It's 1975. And yeah, he was buried there in Portales.
Do you have anything that you want to add to that? No. Okay. You were talking about the funeral for your father. Now, your mother went to Portales to the hospital with your brother. So who took care of you and your siblings?
My uncle, my daddy's brother, lived over 3 miles toward Causey from Goodland, and he lived in a dugout, and we stayed that night. Stayed several nights with him over
And
there.
what were their names?
W.D. Gentry.
I see. Now, your father, was he a farmer?
Uh-huh.
And who did he work for, or did you all own any land?
No, honey, we I forget what you call us, but sharecroppers. he worked for Mr. Hanover, you know, and he shared, we got a share of what we made.
Right. You came to Goodland area in South Bailey County from where?
From Leon Junction, Texas.
Now, where is that? I've never heard of that.
Honey, that is close to Gatesville in Temple, Texas.
Oh.
And it's my family, my mother's family all lived out close to Crawford where President Bush.
So in East Texas, and that's where you returned then later, but then came back to Portales. What brought you back to Portales?
Well, my brother wasn't finding any work down there in Texas where we were, and they had my a cousin that married Amy Hanover. My cousin called down there and told him that he had a job for him out here at Portales at the creamery.
Your brother.
And he was a butter maker.
And that was Perry.
And they sent him, that was Perry, and they sent him later on to Hermiston, Oregon to be a butter maker up there at their creamery.
And so he was the oldest of the 5 children. Perry. Is that right?
He sure was.
And now, the actual dugout, did it look anything like it does right now when you live there?
Well, honey, it looked more used.
More used. That's a good way to put it. And also, I was wondering, I've always heard in the hot summer, which we do have in West Texas, it was still cool. And in the cold winter, which we do have, it was warm. Is that right?
That's the way my mother looked at it.
And what about, where did you sleep in the dugout?
Well, honey, in the beds.
Yeah, you didn't you didn't have pallets.
No, we didn't have pallets unless somebody from school came to spend the night with us.
You could.
But we had, in spite of that dugout not being any bigger than it was, we had up 3 beds.
3 beds in there. Were they regular size? I'm sure. Isn't that something? It's amazing. Wrought iron beds, I bet. And so your mother cooked in there and everything. Would it get too hot when she was cooking, especially in the summer, or not?
Well, I don't recall that.
Anything real specific. Now, was there an outhouse real close by?
There was one back behind the dugout.
So you had modern outside conveniences.
Yes.
Now, when the lightning struck that day back in the 30s, was there a storm that had already come over?
No, it just come up all of a sudden. It seemed like the first time it thundered was
That was
the
it. And
we just went crazy after that. You know, it started raining and they drug the Perry, their daddy, and Mama drug Henry through the rain trying to put out his pants. They was on fire, you know.
And the day of the funeral, it was in the dugout. So you didn't have a funeral home like we have today where you would take the body. The body laid out in there in the home, right? And was there a funeral home that actually helped with the burial or just friends?
Not that I know of. It was just friends, and Mr. Hanover just took over, and he handled it. I know they put a shroud on my dad, and Mr. Hanover come over here and bought this. I guess Muleshoe had a funeral home or something.
And can you remember any other neighbors and friends that lived around you when you lived in the dugout?
Well, the Kirks lived down, and the Matheny's lived one direction, and the Kirks, Matheny's run the store, though, at Goodland.
And do you know what Kirk that would be, Sammy? No, you
It
don't.
was Mike Kirk.
Oh, Mike, you know. I should have asked the right person.
And Dargan was their boy, Dargan Kirk.
Okay. And Matheny's, I've never heard that name before.
Well, honey, Robert Matheny ended up being the president of our college there in Portales.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well,
Yeah.
and how was Robert related to the Matheny's at Goodland? Was he their son?
Yes, he was.
Their son. Well, I'll be. Any other family names from around that were your neighbors?
Well, honey, somebody named Wortham and Lancasters.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you remembered any
I
of
never lived out there.
Oh, you don't know.
No. Well, we just thank all of you. And I'm sure that when you have gone into the dugout now that's here at the Muleshoe Heritage Foundation, some vivid memories come back to you, don't they?
Yes, they certainly do.
What do you remember?
The time I'm going down the steps I can just see visualize his casket being there.
Your daddy's
Uh-huh,
casket.
uh-huh. That's all I see when I go in there nearly is his casket.
And you were how old when he died?
12.
12 years old. Well, I can imagine that would come back to you very vividly. And I think Sammy Simpson has just worked so hard in trying to preserve this, and the members of the Heritage Foundation and their board, and I know you all are pleased.
Oh, yes, honey, we certainly are. Sammy Simpson has been a great help to all of us.
Sammy, was there's something else? What else? Went to work. Oh, yes. What about when your daddy died? Well, then who supported the family? What happened to financially with the family?
Well, honey, we just, I guess Mr. Hanover paid Daddy so much, and we come to Muleshoe once a month, or Perry did, and Mr. Hanover brought him to get groceries.
But after your father died, did Perry then probably take over?
Yes,
Head of the house?
honey, he certainly did. We went back to Texas in 1938.
Now, we were in Texas already. You just went to East Texas is what you meant. Okay.
Yeah, and then he did every kind of job that he could think of. If it was springtime, he worked in the field, or fall, and they always said that he would made a hand just like a man.
Uh-huh.
He was
And he was 14 years old. Did he get to continue in school?
well, no.
He had to quit school and go to work full time to support his 4 siblings and his mom. Right?
Right.
Well, now, did your dad have, besides the two of you, have other children? No. There were the 2 children,
I remember one thing about Perry going to school. The bus from, I think, Stegall went to Carlsbad Caverns, and he thought that was the greatest trip in the world. He come home telling us all about the stalactites and mites.
I bet you thought he'd been to Paris, France.
Yeah, yeah.
I bet that was.
Eiffel Tower.
Oh, Well, thank you all so very much. This is the family of the late Miss Jim Gentry, and Mr. Gentry was killed there. Was he standing really close to the dugout when this happened?
No, he was in a building upstairs up the road from us. He was building some chicken coops, and Henry was out there handing him nails or something.
So it was just nearby.
Uh-huh.
And you were sitting in a pickup playing with your little sister paper dolls.
Yeah, was cutting out paper dolls, and the scissors went out of my hand and up on the dash of that car.
And how close were you to your dad and brother when it happened?
Well, we was halfway from the dugout to there, I guess about as far as Bonnie's car.
So close by, you could see. Okay. And this was 1938?
36.
36. And the Gentrys had been living there in this half dugout that's now here in Muleshoe at the Heritage Foundation for about a year. And if you have not been to the half dugout or the other historic buildings here that are really living history at the Muleshoe Heritage Foundation, they're open 1 to 5 weekdays, Monday through Friday, and by special appointments other times. Field trips and programs can be given here. And when you have visitors come to visit you, be sure and bring them out, because it certainly will be time well spent, and especially children are invited to come because they will enjoy it as well as adults. But as the Gentry kids said down there, they probably won't listen but they will have experienced it, and maybe will start just something in their life of wanting to remember the history of this community and this area. We want to thank Sammy Simpson for inviting us to come out to make this interview